Dentists in many cities are helping to bring the benefits of fluoridation to children.
Look, Mom, no cavities.
Now, our children can have better health through fluoridated water.
Fluoride is safe.
The benefits of fluoridation will last throughout life. They can drink away tomorrow's tooth decay.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in this action will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I will.
I do.
You are appearing today as a representative of the United States Environmental Protection Agency.
As a representative of the CDC.
Yes.
And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
What's the science on this water fluoridation? Is it actually reducing teeth decays, or are there better ways, like through toothpaste? What's the efficacy of this intervention?
When we started in the United States with this fluoridation program, the belief and understanding by the public health community at that time is that we need to swallow fluoride as the teeth are developing, so during the first years of life, that fluoride will incorporate into the tooth and the tooth will be forever more resistant to tooth decay.
The earlier that fluoridated water is used, the greater the benefit. It is a protection that continues throughout life.
So it was a systemic benefit. You need to ingest it. That's why we added fluoride as well to pills that people would swallow. Water and pills. You swallow it, your teeth become stronger for life, and you have less tooth decay. That was the original premise on which this whole fluoridation paradigm was based. However, it's now a consensus, even in the dental research community, is that fluoride doesn't actually need to be swallowed. That the benefit, the predominant benefit, if not the exclusive benefit of fluoride, comes from its topical contact with the outside of the tooth. Topical, not systemic. Okay? Even the Centers for Disease Control, which is an active proponent of water fluoridation here in the United States, the CDC concedes that.
Yes.
So CDC recognizes and accepts that fluoride's predominant mechanism for preventing tooth decay comes from fluoride's topical contact with the outside of the enamel, correct?
Predominantly, that's where the benefits are, yes.
Okay. So you, as a representative of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, agree that fluoride's primary benefit to teeth is topical.
Objection form.
Yes.
Okay. If you don't need to swallow this chemical, why are we still adding it to the water supply where everyone in this population is drinking it every day?
We have not found evidence that supports benefit, that shows benefit to the child if ingested, if community water fluoridation or some other form of fluoride is ingested by the mother.
What are the harms or potential harms from fluoride exposure through the water?
The primary concerns with fluoride exposure are its effects on the brain, particularly the developing brain, its effects on the thyroid gland, its effects on the bones, including its ability to weaken bone, cause bone fracture, as well as its ability to cause arthritis. And I think the question with fluoride is not so much, can fluoride affect the brain? Can fluoride affect the thyroid gland? Can fluoride affect the bones? So CDC agrees with NRC that it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain and the body by direct and indirect means.
Yes, CDC in connection with the Intergovernmental Work Group.
So you would agree, Dr. Barone, that the NRC concluded that fluoride has the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain, correct?
Objection. Yes, I believe their findings are correct.
The evidence is clear that it can. The question is more about what are the doses that can cause these effects, and how do these doses vary based on individual factors like nutrition, like genetics, like kidney function. And one of my concerns is that when you're dealing with fluoride exposure, especially when you're distributing it en masse through the water supply, is you're exposing people who are much more vulnerable to suffering the harm. And I think if we are guided by the principle that we should protect the most vulnerable, then we really should be taking steps to use fluoride in a much more targeted fashion.
Got it. So let's do a deeper dive on those areas. You mentioned first the brain and the developing brain in particular. So how does fluoride affect a developing brain? What's the possible harm there?
So in the past 10 or so years, the National Institutes of Health have funded birth cohort studies to understand if fluoride during the in utero period and during infancy, if it's associated with reductions in IQ and other neurodevelopmental effects. And these studies, which were done in Mexico and Canada, have both found that yes, early life exposure to fluoride is associated with reductions in IQ. And what's remarkable and concerning about these studies is that the amount of IQ loss that they are seeing from fluoride exposure rivals the amount of IQ loss that was seen in the studies on lead.
Is there evidence that children are being harmed by fluoride now on a kind of mass basis?
Well, the recent national surveys in the United States show that up to 80% of kids, 80%, show signs of fluorosis on at least 2 of their teeth. Dental fluorosis is a condition of the tooth enamel that is caused by too much fluoride exposure as the teeth are forming. Infant exposures to fluoride are a major driver of dental fluorosis. A baby that's formula fed with fluoridated water receives over 100 times more fluoride than the breastfed baby.
Yeah, according to this, yes.
Do you think the recommendation to avoid the use of fluoridated water in infant formula is a reasonable and sound recommendation?
Well, it certainly appears to be reasonable given that the dose to infants is potentially greater than the reference dose for dental fluorosis, excuse me. And it provides no benefit at that stage.
So basically, fluoride is interfering with the tooth-forming cells, the ameloblasts, okay? And that is manifested in the form of staining of the enamel. And it takes the form of white specks and splotches that are parallel. So for it to be fluorosis, you would have a white splotch on your upper right front tooth and your upper left front tooth, parallel. When you see that, that's most likely dental fluorosis. But it can also affect other teeth. Some people have it in their molars. Mm-hmm. It all depends on when you were exposed. That's a visible sign of overexposure. So I do think we have a significant overexposure problem today.
So I believe you're involved in litigation. Tell us the story of your litigation related to fluoride.
Right. So I represent a number of environmental health groups and mothers who are concerned about fluoride exposure. And we brought a suit against the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, in 2017, so about 7 years ago. And we brought the case under a law called the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And the allegation in the case is that fluoridation of the water presents an unreasonable risk to human health in the form of neurotoxicity, the effects on the brain. And I am happy to say that this is the first time that citizen groups have filed a petition under this law, TSCA, and managed to get all the way to a federal trial. And that's what we did in June of 2020. We had a 7-day trial, which featured extensive expert testimony from both sides. We were very fortunate to have some of the best scientists in the world who have looked at the fluoride issue, including Dr. Philippe Grandjean, whose work on mercury and IQ was the sort of impetus for government regulations to protect the public from mercury. We were also very fortunate to have Dr. Bruce Lanphier, who's done some of the seminal research on lead and IQ. And Dr. Lanphier talked about his research on fluoride and IQ. And we also actually introduced testimony from EPA's own scientists who made some important admissions in the case about fluoride's ability to affect the brain.
So you would agree that this is an important study here, a prospective birth cohort study, which is finding a significant relationship between low levels of fluoride in the urine of pregnant women and ADHD symptoms in children.
Yes.
And you would agree that this study further supports the need for a reassessment of current safety standards of fluoride in the United States.
Yes, it's one of several.
After the trial, the judge stated that he agreed that there was serious evidence that raised serious questions about whether fluoridation chemicals are safe. But the judge stated he wanted to wait to make a decision until the National Toxicology Program completed its review of this very issue. Okay?
And where is the National Toxicology Program? What is that?
The National Toxicology Program is part of the National Institutes of Health. The National Toxicology Program, which is the NTP, is they are the federal government experts on the toxicology of chemicals. That's what they do. They study chemicals. On that day, the NTP, through one of its directors, Dr. Mary Wolf, emailed the CDC, the FDA, and the NIDCR to let them know that the report was finished and that the NTP would be publishing it in May. Okay? In her email, Dr. Wolf stated, we are sharing this document for your awareness. At this time, the analysis and the conclusions are set. Okay? So they're not inviting further edits. They're saying, we're done. We've completed the report. And then Dr. Wolf notes, quote, we are working towards its release in mid-late May and will share the date when it's set.
What did the report say? What were the conclusions?
The reports say that the evidence consistently associates fluoride exposure with reduced IQ.
The NTP identified 72 studies that have looked at the effect of fluoride on IQ, which the NTP agreed is a large body of evidence. And in the words of the NTP, the vast majority of these 72 IQ studies found that higher fluoride exposure is associated with IQ deficits in children, just like the birth cohort studies in Canada and Mexico had found. So overall, the NTP agreed that fluoride exposure is consistently associated with reduced IQ and that it's unlikely that methodological deficiencies in the studies can explain away this finding.
Immediately after Dr. Wolf at the NTP sent that email, you see correspondence within CDC, within NIDCR, and between those two organizations, talking about coordinating with each other, working with each other on how to respond to the NTP. And also what you see is an email from one of the CDC staffers to the CDC attorney, Joanna Stetner, who then promptly sends the report to the DOJ attorneys who are working on the lawsuit. So immediately the DOJ attorneys have a copy of this report. Now, word starts to get out to the private fluoridation dental lobby. On May 2nd, you have an email talking about, quote, potentially very bad fluoride news, unquote, coming out from the NTP. So word was getting out. There was a meeting on May 4th of the dental lobby. They have a meeting which is organized under this association called the Association for State and Territorial Dental Directors, ASTDD, which receives most of its funding from the CDC. Okay, CDC funds ASTDD to, in part, promote water fluoridation. They actually have a goal to increase the number of people in the country who are receiving fluoridated water. So you have this CDC-funded private organization that sets up a meeting on May 4th, of which consultants to the ADA attend. And at that meeting, a CDC official by the name of Tracy Bamer, who is the fluoridation engineer for the CDC, tells them, quote, CDC is in the process of proactively and preemptively taking steps to intervene in the NTP publication.
Wow.
Okay? Proactively and preemptively taking steps to intervene. Note, by the way, that the CDC is having these discussions with
lobbyists.
Yeah.
Lobbyists.
The same day as that meeting, on May 4th, the CDC sent suggested edits to the conclusion for the NTP report. Okay?
What did they say?
They wanted the NTP to emphasize that this report does not concern water fluoridation. There's no real basis for concern about water fluoridation. And that's been a constant refrain from NIDCR and CDC and the Office of the Director for the NIH.
And that completely went against the NTP report, correct?
Well, the NTP report is principally focused on, is fluoride a neurotoxic? Can it affect the brain? It wasn't as concerned about the level of exposure that causes the effect, although in response to these criticisms from CDC and NIDCR, that there is no basis for concern at the levels we fluoridate water in the United States. The NTP pushed back on that. And they said, actually, the data does provide a basis for concern. You can't say that fluoridation is safe, which was a source of real contention.
Right.
Because the major focus of the CDC and the NIDCR is protecting their favorite policy. On May 9th, 2022, the NTP responds to the CDC and again reiterates that the NTP considers the report to be final. To quote, we believe that the current findings, as stated in the pre-publication draft monograph on fluoride, accurately reflect the scope of our evaluation and the available scientific literature, and no revision is needed.
So NTP was pushing back.
They were pushing back. Again, they said, we've considered all this input from many different stakeholders, and we have determined that the report is final and it accurately reflects the scientific literature. Okay? Then 2 days later, on May 11th, 2022, NTP sends another email to the CDC and the NIDCR telling them the report is coming out next week, May 18th, okay? And that email was sent at 11:12 a.m.
Right.
There is a whole flurry of emails for the remainder of that day and into the next few days by the CDC and the NIDCR and the Assistant Secretary of Health and the Office of the Director at NIH. All of them talking about, oh my, what are we gonna do? Like, they were freaked out, okay? 2 minutes after the email that the NTP sent on May 11th, a director at CDC, Karen Hacker, forwards the announcement and says, we need to get on this ASAP. Please move this forward immediately. So CDC is concerned, okay? And within 5 hours on that day, May 11th, NTP's director, Richard Wojcik, emails his colleagues at the NTP with the disappointing news that, quote, just received word that Admiral Levine wants an official HHS review and clearance of the report before it goes out. So that's within 6 hours of the announcement that the NTP is going to publish this report next week. Nope. The Assistant Secretary of Health wants to review it. So
Right.
things are on hold, okay? Later that night, May 11th at 10:05 p.m., Tara Schwetz in the office of the director for
Right.
NIH, she's the acting principal deputy director, she emails Lawrence Tabak. And in her email, she says, there is no way this is going out on May 18th. We're meeting tomorrow and we'll discuss more. Before it goes out, we will need to clear it and brief the Assistant Secretary of Health. So the Office of the Director is saying, yeah, there's no way we're going to allow
We're
this
not
report.
going to let this go.
Yeah. The next morning, the director of CDC's Division of Oral Health, Casey Hannon, attends a meeting with NTP, the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health, and the Office of Director of NIH. And he emails others at CDC with his takeaways from the meeting. This is, okay. And he writes, the May 18th release date for the NTP report is almost certainly not going to happen. The Assistant Secretary of Health Office and NIH Office of Director are pretty clearly going to get more involved, okay? Which is what the NIDCR and CDC had been wanting, right?
Right.
They wanted to get the higher level authorities at HHS involved to quash this thing,
Right.
okay? So they were getting traction.
Right.
They could see that their work was paying off,
Yeah.
right? That same day, May 12th, the CDC has another meeting with the private dental lobbyists.
Wow.
Okay? Greg Holder, the CDC policy analyst, at this meeting, he starts talking to them about the NTP report and what's going on. But he asks that this discussion be, quote, off the record.
Do you know why the CDC provide the information, quote, off the record?
No, I do not.
So what he had to say to them on that day was, quote, off the record. So we don't have minutes of what he said or notes of what he said, okay? The next day, Greg Holder at the CDC speaks with Judy Feinstein and Chris Wood, who are the leadership of this group that I talked about earlier, ASTDD. This is the group funded by CDC to promote fluoridation,
Right.
okay? Greg Holder has a phone call with them, and he tells them, quote, CDC officials, Assistant Secretary for Health Rachel Levine, and others have looked at the NTP report and are pushing back hard at NTP. So Greg Holder's words are, we are, quote, pushing back hard at NTP. Holder also notes in that meeting that the NTP is, quote, really digging in and standing by their report. God forbid. The NTP is standing by its report. Fast forward to June 3rd, and you have emails from the CDC that confirm that the Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, made a decision to put the report on hold. As one email says, quote, the latest we heard yesterday is that Assistant Secretary of Health Levine has put the report on hold until further notice.
Now, Rachel Levine is the one who ultimately made the decision to put the NTP monograph on hold, right?
Objection, Wax Foundation.
I don't know that personally. I would imagine, I mean, because of her position, she may have the ultimate authority to do that.
But you were specifically told by the CDC that Rachel Levine made the decision, right?
I have been told that Rachel Levine made that decision.
Right, and you were told that by CDC leadership, right?
Objection made.
It could have been the CDC.
So they succeeded. The obstructionists, if you will, succeeded in quashing the report.
Absolutely. So I think the emails make it pretty clear what happened.
Right.
That the conclusions, the scientific conclusions of the NTP were not sufficiently compatible with the policy interests of water fluoridation.
Right.
and that the NIDCR and the CDC, which are principally concerned with promoting this policy, found that unacceptable. They went up the ladder to the Assistant Secretary of Health and convinced the Assistant Secretary to order the NTP to not release the report. That's what happened.
So how did the NTP scientists and directors, how did they respond to this pressure? Do we know?
We know some of it. And the scientific director at the NTP, a scientist by the name of Brian Berridge, did make clear his concerns and misgivings about the political pressure that was being exerted on the NTP. On the morning of May 12th, shortly after being told by Tara Schwetz at the NIH Office of Director that the report is probably not going to be released next week, Brian Berridge responded, "I have significant concerns that the level of engagement on this scientific product has crossed the line from rigorous peer review to ensure balance and accuracy to one that could be construed as attempting to influence the outcomes." Dr. Berridge writes, after 17 years in industry, because Dr. Berridge, prior to working at the NTP, had worked for, I think, certain pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Berridge writes, after 17 years in industry, I've seen efforts to modify messages to fit commercial interests. I wasn't party to that there, and I'm not game to do that here. So he was flagging, like, I have concerns about the integrity of this process. As part of our lawsuit, we received a declaration from Dr. Linda Birnbaum. And Dr. Birnbaum was the director of the NTP from 2009 to 2019. Dr. Birnbaum expressed serious concerns about the political pressures that are being exerted. And I'll read you a quote from her declaration. Dr. Birnbaum wrote, "As someone who believes deeply in NTP's science-based mission, I am concerned by the recent course of events with the fluoride monograph. The decision to set aside the results of an external peer review process based on concerns expressed by agencies with strong policy interest on fluoride suggests the presence of political interference in what should be a strictly scientific endeavor." So that's the assessment of the former NTP director.
Is there any precedent for this in history?
Well, some people have asked me, was I surprised by what happened? And my response is, I wish I was surprised, but I wasn't. Because this is actually a long-standing pattern that we have seen on the fluoride issue at the federal level, where concerns about fluoride exposures and the potential for adverse effects have long been airbrushed away. And we have been provided by our federal health authorities with a very skewed, distorted, and often incorrect sort of assessment of the science. And this goes back to the very beginning.
So let's go back to the very beginning. How does this get started?
So I'll give you one very significant example of data suppression at the very beginning of the fluoridation policy that had very material consequences on safety standards, on fluoride in this country, as well as on fluoridation. Okay? In the early 1940s, public health service scientists were considering this question of whether to add fluoride to drinking water. They were considering it for reasons that we could explain, but one of the reasons was that there had been some studies done in the 1930s that had associated naturally occurring fluoride in the water with reduced tooth decay. So the question at hand was, well, should we go ahead and add fluoride to communities that don't have it in their water? So there was a conference in 1942 which was attended by, among others, H. Trenley Dean. Now, Trenley Dean is called the father of fluoridation. He had been the one who did the studies in the 1930s, looking at naturally occurring fluoride, and he ultimately promoted water fluoridation in the years ahead. But in 1942, Dr. Dean was expressing caution and concern about the potential for adverse health effects from adding fluoride to drinking water. And what he said is, before we do any experiments on fluoridation, before we add this to community water to see if we can replicate the purported benefit, we need to do some studies on potential health effects. And what he talked about doing is, let's go to areas in this country, like in Texas, where there's some pockets of where people have high levels of fluoride in the water, up to 8 parts per million, which is 8 times more than was proposed to be added to water. Dr. Dean said, let's go to those communities and do some studies to see if we can see any toxic effects. Okay? Well, they did that. In 1943, scientists at the Public Health Service went down to Bartlett, Texas, and did a study to look at whether people in that community were suffering effects from fluoride. And they found toxic effects from fluoride exposure. They found bone disease, including the calcification of the ligaments, the bony spurs, and these effects on the joints that are known to cause arthritic symptoms and pains. It's an adverse effect. It was a condition that had been diagnosed in the 1930s by a scientist named Carl Roholm, where he looked at industrial workers who were exposed to fluorine, and he found that it really had a serious effect on the joints and the bones. So Dr. Dean and his team, when they went to Texas, they looked at the bones, and sure enough, they saw the same types of changes in the bone structure and the joints that were seen in these industrial workers. They also, in addition to the bone changes, they were seeing effects on the eyes, actually cataracts. They found a very elevated rate of cataracts in the high fluoride community in Texas. They didn't believe it at first, so they went ahead and they did other studies in South Dakota and Iowa, which also had high levels of fluoride in the water. And sure enough, they found bone changes, bone disease, and they found the cataracts, okay? So they do this study in Texas, and they're doing these studies in South Dakota and Iowa. Do they publish the study? Do they tell the public? Do they tell the scientific community about their findings? No. The Public Health Service never published that study. They never reported those findings to anyone in the public or the broader scientific community.
Wow.
And you have this remarkable moment in April of 1944. You have this committee that's looking at whether to do a fluoridation experiment in Newburgh, New York, close to where we are here today. It would be the first ever experiment where they add fluoride to water to see, 1, if it reduces tooth decay, and 2, if it has adverse health effects. Okay? At this committee, Dr. Dean is there. And Dr. Dean discloses to this committee his findings from Texas.
And what does he disclose?
He discloses that they found these bone changes, and they found a high level of cataracts. He also talks about how they were finding the high level of cataracts in other communities they were looking at as well. Okay?
Okay.
And he tells the committee that. And they asked Dr. Dean, do you have any concerns, based on your findings, of whether adding fluoride to water in Newburgh could present adverse effects? And Dr. Dean's answer was, yes, I do have concerns. Based on what we're finding, I have concerns that fluoridating water could be toxic. Okay? That was never disclosed to anybody in Newburgh, New York, or anyone from the public for that matter. The father of fluoridation, no one knew that he was expressing privately a concern that this policy could be toxic and cause harm, right? That was airbrushed away, okay? Just as the findings from that study from 1943 were airbrushed away, right? Also notable at that meeting, okay, 1944, people at the committee were saying, hey, we're interested in this data. Can we get a copy of this study? We want to look at it. And the chair of the committee, Harold Hodge, said, this data is confidential. Dr. Dean gave us the courtesy of providing this information from the Public Health Service files, but it is not to be shared with anyone outside this committee. So it was clear that the Public Health Service approached this data not as something that to inform the public with, but something that was potentially detrimental to their promotion of water fluoridation and not to be shared with anyone. And they adhered to that. That was not shared with anybody, okay? And that was at the very beginning of this policy. They just suppressed that data, and the public was not able to consider it.
Isn't there a military connection with the Public Health Service?
There was, certainly at that time especially, okay? So in this time, in the 1943, 1944 time frame, it's important to remember that we're in war, it's World War II, and we had the Manhattan Project going on. The Manhattan Project was this massive, sprawling, secret industrial enterprise to build the first atomic bomb to help win the war. And that project involved and required a very large amount of fluoride chemicals. It required a lot of uranium and a lot of fluoride to build the bomb. You couldn't have the bomb without uranium and fluoride back in the 1940s.
So we've all heard about uranium, but I don't think we've heard about fluoride being used in the manufacture of atomic weapons.
Right. I mean, the fluoride piece to the atomic bomb has largely been ignored and forgotten. But when you look at the bomb program documents, you will see that the bomb program scientists, the toxicologists, the chief medical director were very concerned about the effects of fluoride on human health. And they started studying the effects of fluoride on human health. So I mentioned earlier that the chair of the Newberg Committee to fluoridate Newburgh, New York, was Harold Hodge. Harold Hodge was a scientist at the University of Rochester, but he also had another role. He was the chief toxicologist for the Manhattan Project. He went on to be the most important promoter of the safety of water fluoridation, Dr. Harold Hodge, without question. He was the go-to guy for decades to defend and articulate why fluoridation was safe.
Fluoride is safe, and I think I can say in conclusion that there is no health hazard that justifies postponing water fluoridation.
Harold Hodge, as we now know, was very involved with experiments on humans. Because to understand...
Uninformed consent experiments, right?
Absolutely. So to understand how the bomb chemicals would affect human health, Dr. Hodge and others set up a series of experiments where they exposed unknowing hospital patients who were called human products in the documents.
Oh, God, that's awful.
They would expose human products, okay? And they were doing that secretly without the consent of the human products. And then secretly studying these people to understand how uranium, plutonium...
So this is just like Tuskegee. There's no difference, is there?
Yeah,
they're watching the progression of disease, not telling people that they're being subjected to things that can cause them severe harm, if not death.
Right, and in the 1990s, under the Clinton administration, there was a committee formed which was specifically charged with understanding what happened with those human radiation experiments. These are situations where patients would come to the University of Rochester. They might have cancer, they might have been in a car accident, and they had the simple misfortune of getting into Harold Hodge's ward. And then they would proceed to be injected with plutonium or uranium to see if it would cause kidney damage or other harm, or to see how the body would metabolize plutonium or uranium, right? Harold Hodge was involved there in Rochester. He was also involved in coordinating uranium experiments in Massachusetts in the 1950s. That is all well known now. But what is not well known is Harold Hodge's work experimenting on human beings with fluoride. And what is very troubling is when you start to look at the internal, previously classified files from Harold Hodge, he was saying things to the public that directly contradicted what he had found internally.
So he knew he was lying.
Yes, and I'll give you an example. I'll let people make up their own minds. Sure. Okay? So in the 1940s, as part of his work for the bomb program, Harold Hodge exposed humans with kidney disease to fluoride. And he wanted to see if people with kidney disease had any difficulty excreting the fluoride. Because if you can't excrete it out of your body, you start building up toxic levels and can be harmed. he reported in the internal files for the bomb program that the people with kidney disease, some of them couldn't excrete any of the fluoride. They accumulated 100% of it, which is a serious matter. So Dr. Hodge does that, and he also does, in the 1940s, a study on rabbits, where he creates kidney disease in the rabbits, and then he exposes them to fluoride, and of course he finds that the rabbits with kidney disease don't excrete fluoride very well. That's what Harold Hodge found internally. In 1950s, when concerns are being raised by people in Congress and the public about, well, are people with kidney disease at potential risk here from adding this chemical to the water? Harold Hodge wrote in the Journal of the American Dental Association, okay? He wrote that his studies showed that even in severe cases of kidney disease, there is no increased rate of accumulation of fluoride in their body, even in severe cases. And yet internally, he had found out that up to 100% of it was staying in the body. He never disclosed that to the public. No one at the bomb program or the Manhattan Project or the Atomic Energy Commission ever disclosed that to the public. Instead, Harold Hodge says in the Journal of the American Dental Association, there's no reason for concern for kidney patients because they don't have any impairment in their ability to excrete fluoride.
I'm sure the physician on this committee will agree that these people are just as healthy as people who drink ordinary water.
That's exactly right. A great deal of sound medical evidence suggests that these chemical compounds will not harm the human system in any way when used in the recommended proportions, and further, will save teeth, and therefore making it easier for us doctors to preserve the health of the people of Hill and Dale.
I like this fluoridation idea.
The Atomic Energy Commission had a policy for when scientists working for the bomb program could publish or disclose the results of their findings, okay? And in this policy from 1947, the AEC, Atomic Energy Commission, stated that when the data indicates hazards from process chemicals used to make the bomb, of which fluoride was one, uranium was another, right? That data would be very prejudicial to the interest of the government. And because it would increase the number of claims against the government, it would be bad for public relations, and it would be bad for labor relations. So any such data needed to be cleared by the insurance branch at the Atomic Energy Commission. So why is that significant? It's significant because it shows that the research being done by government scientists back then, that there was an express policy that if the data indicated harm, not benefits, harm from fluoride or from any other process chemical, that was detrimental to the government interests, right? And would need to receive approval before being published. So you have a mechanism, an express mechanism, which basically corrupted what was being told to the public, because if it was adverse, if it was detrimental to fluoride, that would be considered detrimental to the government's interest. So it was a climate that was not conducive to open and transparent communication of the actual science. So this is, in my view, highly significant to any understanding of this early science on fluoride. And there's other examples that we can talk about, but what you will see when you start looking back at these documents and these files is that the foundation, the early foundation upon which our fluoride safety standards are based and which so much of our public understanding of fluoride is based, it was corrupted.
You are looking at protection that is being denied to 40 million American children. Why? Why is this safe, simple, proven protection against tooth decay not available to everybody?
I sometimes read this going back to those days, and I just look at the official history of fluoride and the introduction of water fluoridation, and I look at it as so superficial, as just failing to grapple with with what we can see in these internal documents, failing to grapple with the nature of the data suppression that went on back then. I mean, even Frank McClure, the PHS, the public health service scientist who got permission from the War Department to publish on fluoride in the 1940s and went on to promote fluoridation, even Frank McClure, he published a book in 1970 about water fluoridation. And in that book, he talked about the, quote, touchy and unyielding, unquote, issues of data suppression at the federal level were bound to raise questions, about the policy. He recognized that data suppression was a problem at the federal level for fluoride.
Mom! Look, Mom! No cavities! Isn't that wonderful? The dentist says not one new cavity. Pretty smart of you, Mom, switching us to Crest toothpaste.
Yes, Crest is the toothpaste that works, because Crest is the toothpaste with Fluoristan, a special fluoride formula. Fluoride, you know, is the decay fighter dentists use. The decay fighter that dentists put right on the teeth, just as you see it here. Now, with Crest, you can put the same fluoride on your teeth at home, too.
I remember as a child watching, 4 out of 5 dentists or 9 out of 10 dentists support fluoride in your toothpaste. I mean, there was a lot of promotional effort. I think what most people think of when they think of fluoride is it's good for your teeth.
Absolutely, and I think this highlights one of the major consequences and problems of the federal government, the federal health authorities, not being open and not being honest with the public about what they were finding on fluoride toxicity, because it permitted this sort of cultural environment to remain where people just thought of fluoride as calcium, as some really healthy new thing that's going to prevent tooth decay. Because by not presenting the bad side, the bad facts, this caricature notion of fluoride was sort of brought into existence. And it's never gone away. I mean, it's still so many people, when they think of fluoride, they think of shining white teeth, white-coated dentists, and like American apple pie. Like, it's just considered such a essential part of our living today in the modern world.
What does it cost? No more than the cost of an ice cream cone. An average cost of about $1 a year can ensure up to 65% less tooth decay in children.
Data suppression has a real effect on public understanding. It has a real effect on the scientific understanding.
Well, I would call this censorship, and one of the core values of this country historically is the First Amendment. That's certainly something that Children's Health Defense has been working on a lot, is to push back against government censorship around other health issues. And obviously, when you censor health information, as has been the case here with fluoride, you're putting people's lives at risk. It's different to censor health information than to censor political information. They both can be deadly, but censoring health information and censoring information that gets to doctors and to scientists, clearly that's going to impact some people's health and potentially lead to death. So is there any justification for keeping the fluoride in the water today? Why are we doing it today?
Well, I think the first part of the question, I don't think there's a need to continue fluoridating because of what we know about how fluoride, any benefit that fluoride provides can be obtained topically, so you can put it on your teeth and spit it out. There's no compelling reason to be adding it to the water when we're going to swallow that. Your brain doesn't need fluoride. Your thyroid gland doesn't need fluoride. Your bones don't need fluoride. The only part of your body that may benefit from fluoride are your teeth. And you can get the fluoride to your teeth through a very simple, elegant mechanism. You put it on toothpaste, you brush it on, and you spit it out. So I don't think we need to be fluoridating the water anymore, and there's many good reasons to not because of the concerns that we have on the health effects. Right. And Europe shows us that you can remove fluoride from your water and have perfectly good teeth.
The vast majority of Europe does not add fluoride to its water supplies, correct?
Objection. As much as I know, yes, it is correct.
Now, have you, in the course of your research on fluoride, looked at any data with respect to the dental caries rates in Europe?
Yeah, I've looked at the graphic representation of the World Health Organization's charting of dental caries rates, comparing many European countries and the United States.
What does that data show specifically with respect to Europe?
That there is a general decline in dental caries rates throughout Europe.
And how does the decline in caries in Europe compare with the decline in caries that we have seen here in the United States?
Pretty much on a parallel track.
And what significance, if any, do you draw from that fact?
That you don't need to put fluoride in the drinking water in order to have a decrease in dental caries rates.
Dr. Hersey, based on everything you have learned and researched, do you have an understanding as to what percentage of the population in Europe consumes fluoridated drinking water?
It's very low. It's probably around 2%.
But as to your question as to why, I struggle with that question. I don't have a great answer to that question. I do think that the data suppression, the censorship, the distortion of data that occurred in those early years in the 40s and the 50s created a corrupt foundation that really shaped public attitudes, both in the public and in the scientific community and the public health community, about fluoride being generally benign, perfectly safe and fine. And I think that has cast a long shadow over these past 70 to 80 years. So that had a real effect.
Has the mainstream media been covering this trial and this issue at all? Do people know about this? It seems like it affects almost everybody in the country. I'm curious what the role of the media has been on this issue of water fluoridation.
Well, there has been media coverage and some decent coverage of the litigation, as well as some of the issues going on with the NTP. However, not at the sort of major media level like New York Times or cable TV. It's largely just been ignored, and that's consistent with a long-standing pattern that we've seen with major corporate media, where they either ignore the issue entirely, or when they cover it in this caricature way that is so far removed from an intelligent discussion of the issues, so far removed from the real questions that are prompted by any sort of intelligent assessment of the science. And they treat this like it's, on one hand, you have all of science, and scientists saying fluoridation is amazing, it's so effective, it's so safe. How could anyone in the world ever question this, right? And on the other hand, it's like, and then you have a bunch of crackpots who wear the tinfoil hats on their head, and those people, right? The kooks and the cranks and the conspiracy theorists. So that's the way the media presents this issue. And I would say that is such a disservice. It's a disservice to the public. It's a disservice to the trade of journalism. And it's frankly sad to see. And, I think we both know.
I get it. I'm kind of familiar with that media paradigm, yeah.
And, here's just an example. Okay, just one little tidbit of an example. The New York Times published something, it was maybe 10 years or so ago, and they said, the science on fluoridation has been settled since the 1950s. There's no point in basically covering this anymore. It's settled. The science is settled. It's done. No more need to even engage in some of these questions. And I just thought about how anti-scientific that sentiment is. And I think it speaks to this broader sort of almost weaponization of science, where we are told to trust the science. Trademark, trust the science, right? And I think that's interesting. What does that mean? What does it mean to trust the science? And I think ultimately what it means is trust these institutions that are the mediators of the science. Trust them, because they will tell you the truth. And I think that that sort of creates this attitude, this kind of deferential sort of, okay, don't think for yourself, just listen to these institutions, that I think is a bit troubling.
People sometimes call this scientism rather than science, and it's really trusting in dogma and kind of the new priest class, right? And President Eisenhower warned of this when he was leaving the presidency, about the scientific technological elite that could really take control. And it's a theme that runs through a lot of these issues.
And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
As a rep of CDC, to my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that.
Fluoridation is endorsed by the American Dental Association, State and Territorial Dental Health Directors, American Association of Public Health Dentists, Public Health Service, Federal Security Agency, State and Territorial Health Officers, American Public Health Association, and the American Medical Association.